Good morning, everybody. Welcome to your fields, your results, findings from the On-Farm Network, hosted by both Manitoba Pulse and Soybean Growers and Manitoba Crop Alliance. My name is Morgan Kotz. I'm the Agronomy Extension Specialist for Special Crops with the Manitoba Crop Alliance. So thank you to everyone who's in attendance right now. There's quite a few of you, so things are looking really good right now. So we normally share these results of our on-farm trials with trial participants at an in-person event, and we certainly hope that we're able to do that again post-pandemic in December. So we'll stay tuned for that. And some of you may be unfamiliar with our on-farm trials and what they entail exactly. Our presenters, Jordan and Megan, will go into depth on that, but my summary is basically that the goal of these trials is to, one, work directly with our producers to conduct controlled, replicated trials on their own farm and for their own farm, to enable producers to perform similar trials independently if they prefer. 3, to help make producers more profitable through research that has the ability to provide real returns. And finally, 4, to create the network and system so that producers have the capacity to implement research trials on their own farms. We want to be expanding on small plot research rather than replacing it because there's, of course, a need for both small and large plot research. Between the MPSG and MCA, we have on-farm trials in barley, corn, dry beans, faba beans, peas, soybeans, and spring wheat. If you or anyone you know or is interested in getting involved with any of our on-farm trials, we'd be more than happy to chat with you about it, and you can contact our respective offices for more information. Before I introduce our first speaker, there are some housekeeping items that everyone is likely very, very familiar with by now. But to go over, on the right side of your screen, you see your table of contents, basically. So in the chat box, we'd like you to use that if you have any comments or observations during the webinar, and everyone can interact together in that spot if you so choose. There's also a separate question chat box, and we want you to direct your questions to our presenters in that box. The presentations will be recorded and posted to both manitobapulse.ca and mbcropalliance.ca following the live webinar. You can find them there. We'll probably also be posting them on social media. Okay, so with that, I think we're ready to begin. We're going to start with Jordan Karpinchik of Tonag Consulting Limited. Jordan has been presenting our corn and spring wheat results at our appreciation event for the past few years, so he's hopefully a familiar face to most of you by now. So when we started working with Tonag in 2017, Jordan and Elizabeth really spearheaded this program with us, and they've been instrumental for the MCA and of course our past commodity organizations by building relationships with our cooperators or producers and running our on-farm trials seamlessly, or so it seems on our end at least. So Jordan, I'll pass it over to you whenever you're ready to begin. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Morgan. All right, so as Morgan said, I'm presenting some research from Manitoba Crop Alliance. So let's get started. So today we're going to touch upon 3 trials that we've run over the past few years with MCA. The first one and the bulk of the presentation is going to be on the corn split nitrogen trial that we ran for 3 years. And then I'm going to briefly touch on a few projects that are still running. The first one being the Fusarium head blight management through fungicide timing, and the second one being management of lodging in spring wheat using a plant growth regulator. So a little bit of a background of where this corn split nitrogen trial came from. Obviously, as most of you remember, the years of 2014 to 2016 were very wet. There was a lot of interest in delaying some or most of the nitrogen application, especially for our late season crops such as corn, to potentially help mitigate early season nitrogen losses that we most definitely were experiencing in some form, especially with how wet spring and June and early July were. So Manitoba Crop Alliance made it a priority to determine whether this is a beneficial practice for corn growers in Manitoba to split nitrogen. So for from 2017 to 2019, we had 28 sites. 21 sites were with conventional fertilizer, and we had 7 sites that utilized manure. Obviously, as you see, I have a star indicated there. We're going to focus on the conventional sites today. The manure sites, if anyone has any questions about it, I can address them afterwards. But the talk will focus on the conventional fertilizer. So our methodology, we had randomized and replicated strips across the a farmer's field with 3 treatments, which would be the farmer's base rate of nitrogen applied in the spring. The second treatment would be their base rate minus 40 pounds of nitrogen. And that was only included in the final 2 years of the study. The first year we did not have that treatment. That was something that working with actually at the time Manitoba corn growers and John Hurd from MARD, we decided that it was interesting to see what we could grow with reducing the rate a little bit. And the third treatment would be the base rate of nitrogen minus the 40 pounds of nitrogen in the spring, and then to side dress that 40 pounds between V4 and V6. So just a kind of an overview of what we were working with fertilizers. So in terms of base rate, in terms of the fertilizer from the spring, the bulk of the producers that we worked with applied it as urea, around 57%. Next being UAN at 33%, which was generally sprayed just after planting. And we had a few producers that used anhydrous in the spring. In terms of side dress application methods, we did have quite an array. That's kind of the fun thing about working with farmers with their own equipment. We definitely get to see a lot of different ways to put down product throughout the growing season. The bulk of it was done with Y drops, so 41%. The broadcast followed, then streamed, injection, and dribbled urea. So we did some in-season testing to kind of monitor nitrogen throughout the season. So soil sampling prior to the application event, and then also prior to pre-side dress nitrate N, which were those soil tests were done around V2 to V3. We took NDVI imagery in early to mid-August to kind of check on areas that just to see how nitrogen levels were throughout the field and how the crop was looking across the or how the trial was looking. And we also did corn stalk nitrate tests at So our range of soil nitrogen, I mean, for the most part, producers were targeting 150 bushels an acre of corn over those 3 years. We did have quite a range of nitrogen applied. I mean, we were working with different soil types, of course, but the goal was still the same. So we had a range of 125 to 229 pounds of N per acre, with an average of 181 pounds of nitrogen per acre. In terms of N per bushel, it is just around 1.2 pounds per bushel, which is, was kind of the current guidelines from AgVise laboratories, and provincial recommendations were somewhere around there. So producers were generally following the rule of thumb at the time. So our pre-side dress nitrate test results showed quite a bit of nitrogen at the clay sites, and we had quite a few. Obviously, most of our corn's produced on in the Red River Valley, so we had quite a few sites that had heavy clay soils. So there was a strong correlation that no additional nitrogen would be needed at any of the clay sites. When we go to loam or sandy loam soil, there was definitely a few sites that showed the need for more nitrogen, which is good. I mean, that's something, I don't know if it was just due to the fact that we had some losses or just how the soils were affected by the nitrogen that was applied in the spring. But we had a strong correlation at only 2 of the 9 sites, but we definitely saw more of a range. So this is just an example of what our NDVI imagery looked like. This one was taken in August 2019. And this one also has a zero nitrogen check cell, which you can see in the top of the image, just to kind of show what that looks like from a drone perspective. In case that I know producers are using a lot more tools like Red Edge and NDVI imagery, whether it's from satellites or drones. So this is just kind of an idea what that looks like. And then obviously we went and checked and verified, and yes, that corn was very yellow at this time of year in mid-August when we had dried out. So this is some research. We worked with John Hurd on the, John actually hand harvested all of our zero nitrogen check cells just to see an idea of what kind of yield that we would be getting in those small checks without any fertilizer. So basically non-nitrogen fertilized areas yielded about 70% of the fertilized treatments. So not a total loss. I mean, obviously we know that fertilizer works, especially for crops like corn, but we're still looking at roughly, at least in 2019, 70% of the fertilized areas. So on to the results. So not a whole bunch of difference between applying in the spring and applying your splitting your application. Basically, most of this could be attributed to the fact that the 3 years that we ran this trial, we were below average moisture for most of the province, especially the corn growing regions. Looking at that, some years 35 to 50 or 60% of normal. But at the end of the day, we had 2 out of 21 sites show a positive yield response to the split application nitrogen. And I'll get a little bit more into details on that in a bit. But our low sites, so that's those blue dots on the screen, we only had a negative response to that 40 pounds of nitrogen fertilizer less treatment 3 times. So it wasn't, the big, I know a lot of guys say 1.2 pounds per bushel, so I should have lost 30 bushels, but that obviously wasn't the case. In some areas, we actually increased yield with less fertilizer. So I mean, whether that's just a one-time thing or something that could be explored further, that's it's just it was very interesting to see how tight the spread was even on with that 40 pound less treatment. So just a few observations that we made at certain sites. So the only site that we had a statistically lower yield for the split app treatment was our 2017 site that was near Niverville. This site, the farmer producer wanted to wait until V8 to apply his 40 pounds of nitrogen based on the research that's been done south of the border, especially in the Corn Belt. Obviously, they have a much longer growing season than us, so we just seem to have missed the opportunity for that corn to be able to utilize that in our cooler, shorter season up here. So basically, what that suggests is that earlier applications of the side dress nitrogen V4 to V5 stage was much less risky, and again, it mostly contributed to the fact that nitrogen was stranded at the soil surface because it was so dry. Especially 2017, you guys remember July and August. I mean, it was hot and dry, and there was very little movement. I mean, this nitrogen was applied with a Y dropper, but with UAN and agricane, and it, for the most part, just sat at the surface and gassed off eventually. So both our yield responses to the side dress nitrogen came on Elmissippi soils in the McGregor area. So if we're looking at only our loamy fine sand soil types, our response to side dress nitrogen increases to 1 in 3 years. So definitely a lot more potential in our later soils, especially the Elmissippi sands, where we had quite a few corn trials over the years. So in terms of the price, like what that would do, so at those 2 sites, the average response was 8.7 bushels an acre to the split app versus our spring applied. Obviously, they were both done with UAN, but the cost, because of both producers used UAN in the spring, the cost was pretty much the same for the nitrogen. Just the extra application of the sprayer going across at $6.50 an acre. With the price at $5 a bushel, we're looking at $37 an acre profit on our loamy fine sand soils. So again, in that case, you're looking at kind of a 1 in your net gain in bushels per acre can handle only a 1 in 5 year response. You're still ahead of the game at those prices. Obviously, if corn prices go up, it makes it even better. So just another observation, for the 21 sites that we looked at over the 3 years, are low yielding sites, generally that 100 to 130 bushels an acre, required 1.43 pounds of nitrogen per bushel to produce that yield. And our high yielding sites, 140 to 175, so generally what the most producers were aiming for, required 1.09 pounds of N per bushel. So definitely producers that generally yield higher can, which the data shows, and which I believe John Hurd does some studies, and it's very similar numbers to this in his small plot data. That 1 bushel or 1 pound of nitrogen per bushel seems to be the magic number for yielding. So just a quick summary there. Over the 3 years, there's been a yield response in favor of split app nitrogen 2 out of 21 times, or 10% of the times, with an average of roughly 0 across all trial sites. And again, those 2 sites were in Almasippi soils in McGregor. The data suggests that earlier applications, V4 to V5, definitely less riskier than delaying until V6 to V8, where some of the research, or most of the research south of the border, would indicate when to apply. So that was a very interesting thing that we learned. And out of the in-season scouting tools that we used, NDVI imagery was definitely the best indicator of corn yield response to nitrogen. Okay, switching gears. So here's a bit of a background on the Fusarium head blight timing trial. So Manitoba Crop Alliance, obviously Manitoba wheat and barley growers at the time, we're interested to see the impact of FHB on the quality of harvested grain for wheat and barley growers in Manitoba. This project we worked with, and we are still working with Regine Picard from Manitoba Agriculture to help further develop the province's FHB modeling system, to help make decisions on not only when to use fungicide, but also to hopefully improve timing, to make sure that we're applying it when it needs to be applied. So this trial has 2 different methodologies. One being leaving just 1 untreated check strip. It obviously depends on the comfort of the grower that we're working with, and at the time, what conditions are like. If I know sometimes in years past, missing strip with FHB fungicide would not be recommended due to the high levels of Fusarium. But the other option would be to leave at least 4 untreated check strips, so we can run stats on yield. So that was the 2 options that we have for this trial. So some preliminary results. As you might expect, basically applying fungicide has increased yield over the untreated checks in wheat. What you may not expect is that it's roughly only about 2 bushels difference between the applying fungicide and not, which in my math, I'm doing the math right, I'm using a product like Prezero at anywhere from $15 to $20 an acre. Wheat prices have to be generally pretty good to justify that cost. Now, the same thing as the corn trials, we've run this 2018, 19, and 20. Haven't seen a lot of Fusarium, which I'll show in a second, but that's just something to keep in mind. So far, 5 out of the 18 trials have shown a statistical increase in yield by applying fungicide at either the late or recommended timing versus the untreated check. So in terms of quality, our protein, late timing, early timing, untreated check, all within a 0.1 of a decimal, hovering around that 14%, which is very good. In terms of DON and FDK levels, we've only observed this at 3 sites in very low numbers. Like the test limit of detection is 0.3, and we're in that 0.4 to 0.5 range. Very trace amounts at 3 sites over the 3 years. And we had no statistical differences between any of the treatments for DON, FDK, as well as test weight and falling. Okay, so for our PGR trials, Manitoba Crop Alliance, again, wheat and barley at the time, wanted to see what the effects of using a plant growth regulator like Manipulator 620 was on plant height, yield, and milling quality of spring wheat. So for the milling quality, seed samples that we collected at harvest were sent to Siggy's lab in Winnipeg, and they did the quality testing the past 2 years. So just a brief slide to show, the good, better, and best application timings for a product like Manipulator. Growth stage 30 to 32, generally just at the start of stem elongation is the best timing, and that's where the bulk of our trials were from. We also did 1 or 2 sites that did a split application. So one with herbicide, growth stage 22, 23, and then they followed up with something at flag leaf, just at that growth stage 37 to 39. And just a quick picture to show what we generally look like, or the stage that 5 leaf, 1 tiller kind of stage that we're looking for for application. In terms of plant height, we are seeing a statistical difference in almost every site. I believe there's only 4 sites so far that have not seen a statistical difference in height. And we're looking at roughly 6 centimeters across our 32 sites in height difference. Again, years that we don't have a ton of rain and obviously a ton of lodging in our wheat either, but this is just, in drier than normal years, you're looking around that 5 to 8 centimeter. And in terms of yield, not as much as maybe some people would like to see, but still statistically the same. Treated on average 76 bushels an acre, untreated 75. We have seen a statistical difference in about 20% of the sites in terms of yield. Only a couple, I didn't do the economics for this presentation, but only a few of them have shown a economic advantage as well. Most of them generally just pay for the product application and product. In terms of quality, protein, treated and untreated, the exact same. I know there was, going into this study, there was a lot of talk about potential for lowering protein and affecting milling quality. And as you may have seen already, we've seen, at least in the 2019 data from Siggy, there's been no differences in milling yields between the Brandon, Cardale, and Foliar wheat varieties that we've tried. Although we did see an increase in milling yields from Cameron and Rowan wheat, and that's something that, again, we only have a few site years for those varieties. Well, obviously the bulk of our data is coming from Brandon, but there is some potential there. And treatment with a PGR did not impact the overall flour performance or bread quality on a laboratory scale, which is great news. I mean, obviously there's we're adding these things to make maybe our life easier in after post harvest with maybe less tillage passes, things like that. We don't want to be affecting our flour potential and making it more difficult for our millers. So that's really good data to see. Just a brief thing, if anyone wants to see any single site data, I put an example on the screen for trials that have been run obviously before by Manitoba corn growers and wheat and barley. There's a link here, but cropalliance.ca, and just look for on-farm research page, and everything is there for you to see. And just some acknowledgements for Manitoba Crop Alliance. Farmer cooperators, obviously, without them, this research and data would not be able to be generated. So much thanks there. John Hurd and Regine Picard from Manitoba Agriculture and Manitoba Agriculture. We'll just stick with that. Advice Laboratories, Belgium, Canada for supplying Manipulator, and Siggy for their work with the seed samples collected at harvest. And for 2021, Toni Consulting, we're working again with Manitoba Crop Alliance on these types of trials. So wheat, PGR, looking at Manipulator and Modus this year. That's something that's finally should be available for most producers if interested. We're going to be doing the FHB timing trial, seed treatment, seeding rate, which is new, for barley, malt variety, FHB timing, and PGR, both okay for barley as well. And continuing our research on seeding rates with corn, And a new project for this year is seeding rates for sunflowers, both confection and oilseed. And there we go. So I'm going to pass this along to Megan to keep things going.
Okay, I'll get my screen up here. Hopefully this works well. Okay, so I think we should be in business here. Just give me 1 second to adjust things. My end, there we go. All right, so I am Megan Burns, the agronomist for the On-Farm Network program with the Manitoba Pulse and Soybean Growers. So we'll move into what we've been finding in our On-Farm Network trials so far. Maybe if I can advance my slides here. There we go. Okay, so I have a lot that I'm going to cover pretty swiftly today. So bear with me and make sure that you're using the question box that you have access to, and we'll get to your questions and any questions for Jordan at the end here. And of course, if there's anything that you want more details on or to have a more in-depth discussion about, please feel free to contact me via phone or email at any point to do that. So just to give you an update or a sense of where we're at with the On-Farm Network program so far. So we've been at this for about 9 years now, and we have over 360 trials that we've run so far on farm across about 20 different trial types. So I'll get into some of those specific results right now, starting with soybean seeding rate trials. So results from our soybean seeding rate trials to date kind of started to come out in our last edition of Pulse Beat, and that will be followed up with another article on these results in the spring edition, which should be hitting your mailboxes in just a couple weeks here. So you can look for more details there. But really why this trial type came about is because soybean seed is so expensive, certainly relative to seed costs for other crops you might grow on the farm. So the question is really, can I reduce my soybean seeding rate to save on that cost per acre without having a negative effect on yield? So we've been investigating this question since 2012, and so far we have a total of 86 trials across quite a wide range in seeding rates so far. So you can see the spread of trials from 2012 to 2020 there. Out of those 86 trials, we've had 18 that have had significant yield differences between seeding rates, and of those, 12 showed economic response. So where that increase in yield with the higher seeding rate was enough to at least cover the seed cost or the increased seed cost in the spring. Now, I just want to put a little caveat on my economic analysis here. So right now, what we use in the on-farm network is an expected market price range of $10 to $12 a bushel for soybean. Now, obviously, that's not very reflective of what the markets are doing right now. So this is a more sort of conservative estimate on the economic side. But the idea is to use an expected market price range that's at least somewhat stable over time in terms of what you can expect if such a thing exists for market prices of our commodities. So we'll look at adjusting that going forward if prices continue to trend high, but I just wanted to put that kind of full disclosure statement on our economics, that it'll be a fairly conservative analysis that we have here relative to market prices today. Okay, so putting this all together, what do we see across our soybean seeding rate trials? Well, we're finding that about 80% of the time, seeding rate doesn't seem to have a big influence on soybean yield. But with that said, what can we learn from the yield differences that we are seeing where we do have significance? So we'll dive into that. And I know this is a lot, but I'm going to kind of guide you through here what I want to draw your attention to. So we have some of our different seeding rate comparisons that we've conducted in the on-farm network. We have the number of times that we've made that comparison in an on-farm network trial. This percentage here shows the percent of the time that we're seeing a significant yield response to that increased seeding rate, what that looks like in terms of an average response, and then how frequently that response was economic. So what this indicates here is we have 4 trials where we've seen a significant yield increase with that increase in seeding rate, but only 1 time out of the 4 was it actually an economic decision, and the increase in yield was enough to offset the increase in seed cost. So that's what we're working with here. I'm going to guide us through this, and then I will summarize everything more neatly on the next slide. So just bear with me as we go through this here. So when we take a look at our results and how they might apply to what seeding rate decisions you're going to make on the farm, I think the very first thing I'm going to do is cross off the idea that we need to seed over 200,000 seeds an acre. And in fact, we're going to go through and cross off the 290,000 seed per acre rates too. And the reason for that is when we look at these higher rates, we're not seeing very much in terms of frequency of having a significant yield increase at that higher rate
And it certainly doesn't seem to be, a very economic decision, even when that significant increase in yield is there. And you might say, well, having a significant economic increase 2 out of 3 times here is pretty good, but we're only seeing a significant yield difference 8% of the time when we look at increasing from 160,000 to 190,000 seeds per acre. So those higher rates probably aren't super necessary. When we look at the bottom half of the table here, things get a little bit interesting. So you'll notice that we have a much more reliable economic response, I would say. So when that significant yield difference is there, it's paying for itself more often than not at these rates that we're working with in the lower half of the table here. So taking a look at, the frequency of response, we certainly have a little bit better response than we did at the, higher rates. But when we look at where we have these higher frequencies of significant yield increase, we don't have a large number of site years yet. So, are you going to make a seeding rate decision based on just a few site years of data? I'm not sure. And what's kind of happening over time in the on-farm network with seeding rate trials is we're kind of transitioning to testing some lower ranges. So we're just starting to fill in those gaps, I guess, in our knowledge of, how low can we go with soybean seeding rates. So we'll be able to continue building up our trial numbers here to kind of fill out this information and see if these trends seem to stick as we build our trial database with these lower rates. And then just looking at the last kind of lowest range that we were working with at the bottom here, certainly reliable economic response, but we're not seeing a significant yield increase very often. So that was a lot of information, and what the heck does this mean for seeding rate decisions on the farm? I think we can summarize it something like this. So like we said, seeding at 190,000 seeds an acre or higher is probably not necessary. So we're not seeing very frequent yield response, and when it's there, it's not very often paying for itself, right? So that doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. So where does that leave us? Probably somewhere in the neighborhood of like 180,000 to 150,000 seeds an acre with some question marks. And the question marks are there because, like I said, we're going to continue with these seeding rate trials, and we need to sort of fill in the gaps in those lower seeding rates to kind of more reliably determine what that lower threshold of our optimum seeding rate range should be. And keep in mind that this refers to trials where we've seen significant yield response, but 80% of the time the data is telling us that seeding rate isn't making a big difference in soybean yield. So if we look at this from how do we save some costs on the farm, if you're looking at taking your normal seeding rate and reducing it by something like 30,000 seeds an acre, that's a pretty decent cost savings on the farm. And obviously, I have a little caveat here that we need to look at reducing seeding rate within reason, right? If you're already on the lower end of the spectrum, you want to make sure that you're not dropping your seeding rate off too low. And I do think that it's important to continuously evaluate seeding rates and seeding rate decisions on your farm and how successful the seeding rate decisions you're making are, because there are so many farm-specific factors that go into a seeding rate decision and the success of a seeding rate decision. So what works well for one farm in one year, might not even work well for that same farm in another year with very different growing season conditions, and it certainly might not apply to another farm in another region. So I think this is something that's really important to continuously evaluate on a kind of farm-by-farm basis. And if it's something that you're curious about for your farm and you're looking at adjusting your seeding rates, I would encourage you to participate in the on-farm network to get some homegrown data, because nothing beats having results right from your fields on your farm. So with that, I want to move into our soybean row spacing trials and just give a really brief update on what we're seeing for these. So we're just at 2 years of these trials so far. So we started them in 2019, and we have 3 different comparisons that we've looked at so far. So a lot of 7.5 versus 15-inch, 10 versus 20, and a lot of 15 versus 30. And you'll notice that we are seeing significant yield response. So in 2019, we had 2 out of 7 sites that had an increase in yield with a narrower row spacing. And then 3 out of 5 sites with response in 2020. So we're seeing some pretty good response so far. And in 2020, we also started looking at canopy closure as something to measure in our row spacing trials. There's nothing surprising in these results. It was kind of validating what we would have expected to see. And that is that, obviously canopy closure decreases as our row spacing widens. And the difference in canopy closure between our row spacings, that difference gets smaller as the season progresses and the rows continue to close. So certainly nothing out of the blue or unexpected here, but a good thing to validate going forward. And I do have a bit of a change that we're going to make to our seeding rate trials, or sorry, our row spacing trials in 2021, just kind of opening up the treatment options a little bit more. And we'll get into what that looks like at the end of the presentation, where we talk about our 2021 trial plans. Okay, so we're going to transition away from kind of seeding timing decisions into some mid-season stuff. And I want to take a bit to talk about our fungicide trial results and the results that we've been seeing for each of the crops that we've done fungicide work in. And we're going to start out with soybeans. So in soybeans, white mold is really the only foliar disease of concern when it comes to an effect on yield. And even at that, the concern is generally very small for yield impacting effects of white mold on soybeans, certainly relative to the risk for other crops like canola and things like that. But let's see what we're learning from our on-farm trials so far. So going back to our maps here, we started soybean fungicide trials in 2014. We have 66 trials so far. Of that, we've seen just 11 significant yield responses to fungicide application in soybean, and only 6 times was that an economic decision where that increase in yield was enough to at least cover the cost of the fungicide application. So, you know, returning to our handy pie charts to kind of visualize this, we're certainly not seeing very much in terms of responsiveness of soybean to fungicide application. And when that response is there, it's only economic about 9% of the time. So what does this mean? Well, 9% of the time is like 1 out of every 11 years. So if we assume that, you know, you're a farmer who goes out and sprays by calendar date and does kind of just in case fungicide applications, just hypothetically assuming this, of course, and you're going out and you are spraying fungicide every year for 11 years, that's a total accumulated fungicide cost of like $165 an acre. And according to our kind of probabilities of response, if we assume that this applies to your farm, then only 1 out of those 11 years are you going to see a profit boost. And what that profit boost has looked like in our on-farm network trials, where we see this 9% of responsive sites, you might get a profit increase anywhere from $1 an acre to $20 an acre. So you might say, well, $20 an acre, like that's a great yield increase, a great profit boost. And it is in that 1 year. But you have to look at your accumulated cost over time if this is a management decision you're making again and again. That $20 an acre doesn't go very far in covering that accumulated fungicide cost in all the years where it didn't pay for itself and it didn't make a difference in yield. So if white mold pressure is something that you're concerned about on your farm, how do we go about predicting the 1 year where we might see response, so to speak? And it's going to come back to these same factors for every fungicide decision that you're going to make on your farm. I don't think I have anything new to say here, right? We need to think about what are the conditions? Are they conducive to disease development? Do we have that disease pressure there from our field history and observations that we've made, or what we know about how the field has done in the past, et cetera, et cetera. So it really comes down to scouting before you're making that spray decision. But I think when we boil it down for soybeans, like we're seeing very small increases generally in yield, very infrequently for response to fungicide application. And that product cost isn't inexpensive, right? Like that's a fairly substantial cost to the farm and something I think you want to critically evaluate before making that choice for sure. And just really boiling it down, like foliar disease in soybeans is not the yield robber that you need to be worried about. Certainly not in soybeans relative to, you know, other crops, which we'll see in just a couple minutes here. So to summarize, at the end of the day, when it comes to soybean fungicide decision making, I would just really ask yourself if, you know, your dollars are well spent on soybean fungicide, or perhaps those dollars are better allocated to fungicide and other crops like peas. So we'll move into our pea fungicide results now. In peas, the major foliar disease of concern for pertaining to fungicide decision making is Mycosporella. There's also some white mold, but Mycosporella is usually what we're most concerned about with making a fungicide decision. So we've been conducting pea fungicide trials since 2017, so they're a bit of a newer trial type, and we're still in the process of building out this data set. But we have a decent number of trials so far. So we're looking at 27 trials in total. Out of those 27 trials, we've seen 9 significant yield responses, 5 of which have shown to be an economic decision. So when we look at how this breaks down in our pie chart here, it's certainly we certainly have more responsiveness in our peas to a fungicide application. certainly compared to what we were seeing in our soybeans. The economics still, the economics, it plays out favorably economically more often than it does in something like soybeans. It's still not the most reliable economic response, only 16% of the time. I think part of what comes into play there is, pea fungicide is generally more expensive, and you might be looking at double applications more frequently based on disease pressure and things like that. But we're certainly seeing at least more responsiveness in peas than we are in soybeans for sure, which shouldn't really be a big surprise. So we have to break our results down a little bit further for pea fungicide because we have some different combinations of kind of fungicide strategies going on in our different trials. So this just summarizes what we're seeing for each trial type that we've had. So we have trials that look at a single application versus none, a single versus double versus none, single versus double application, and then we've had one double versus done trial. And really, when I look at this information kind of side by side like this, what I take away is that we seem to have more frequent response, larger response, and response that is more reliably economic where we have double application in our trials. And what it all boils down to, as it always does with fungicide decision making, is disease pressure. So like I said, our double versus single trials seem to have more frequent response, larger response, more economic response. So does that mean double application is a superior management decision for peas? No. What it's really telling us is that fungicide application will likely pay where there's disease pressure or conditions for disease development. So our trial locations where a farmer is making a decision to include a double application in their trial are those trials where that disease pressure is higher, and that's a management decision that they would be making, regardless of if the trial is there or not. So what we're seeing is when that disease pressure is there in peas, it certainly seems to pay for itself to go in and manage that with fungicide application. And we do have a tool, you might be familiar with this, so you can find this on our website at this URL here. So this is a fungicide decision-making worksheet for managing mycospirilla in peas. And this is something that we're starting to actually apply to our fungicide trials, pea fungicide trials in the on-farm network. So we're starting to go out pre-spray and work through this checklist here. Then the fungicide trial goes in, and at the end of the season, we can kind of retroactively look back and see if this worksheet is working, so to speak, in helping us make that fungicide decision. So we just started doing that. We need a couple more years of evaluation, but we'll definitely keep you up to date on whether or not it seems to be working well. So like I said, for peas, it seems like dollars well spent on fungicide when disease pressure is high enough. And of course, the when disease pressure is high enough part is always the tricky part in making fungicide decisions. So we'll move into our dry bean results now. So obviously in dry beans, the biggest yield robber of concern here with foliar disease is certainly white mold, and that can be quite devastating to yield in dry beans. We have a pretty limited data set relative to our other fungicide trials in soybeans and peas. So we've been conducting these for a few years, just 14 trials so far, and the buck stops there in terms of results because we haven't seen any significant yield responses yet in our dry bean fungicide trials. But I will point out, we had, several dry years in there across our span of years where we've been conducting these trials, and disease pressure just wasn't there, right? So again, that common theme coming out that we should all be familiar with, if the disease pressure isn't there, that fungicide application isn't going to do anything for you in terms of advancing your yield or increasing your profit. So we will be continuing forward with these trials to try and capture responsiveness in a year where we do have higher disease pressure. Just wanted to point out that we do have a similar tool to what I just showed for the peas for making fungicide decisions in dry beans, and you can find that on our website as well. And then the last trial I want to cover in detail is our Faba bean fungicide trial. So we just got going with these in 2020, so we just had one trial up here in the Swan River area. It did have a significant yield response to fungicide application, and it was also a very economic choice. If we take a look at the results from this trial, you'll see that we had a really big yield increase to fungicide application here, almost 16 bushels an acre. And like I said, that was a very economic decision for this farmer to make. In fact, we probably could have used a double application of fungicide here because disease pressure was quite high. So this is something that we are looking forward to expanding our data set and working on this trial in other years to capture response in different environments and growing season conditions, and see how disease pressure plays out differently between years, but also between different faba bean growing regions in Manitoba. So putting all of this side by side and together for our fungicide trials, what kind of big picture messages can we take away here? I think starting with soybeans, like 10 times out of 11, just save the $15 an acre is what I would say. We're not seeing a frequent response. We're not seeing economic response very often. And like I said, you know your farm better than anyone else. So make sure you are paying attention in your scouting if necessary, if you're concerned about white mold pressure for whatever reason, whether it's rotation related and environment related. But more often than not, that isn't an economic decision to make in terms of where you're spending your fungicide dollars. When we look at the pulse crops, on the other hand, it seems pretty likely that a spray is going to pay for itself when disease pressure is there, right? So I think it all boils down to making informed decisions to protect your bottom line. And this is nothing new when it comes to fungicide decision making and disease management on the farm. We want to make sure that we're making an informed decision. Is that pressure there? Are conditions conducive to development of that disease pressure, and use those tools available to help make those choices. So with that, I just want to spend a couple minutes talking about what we have planned for the coming growing season to get you excited, what we're looking forward to for the coming year. So just highlighting a couple things by crop type that might catch your attention. So we're going to carry forward with biological trials, which we've been conducting for, I believe, 2 years now. And I just a little plug for a non-farm network program here. This is a really valuable sort of tool available to farmers to kind of have third-party unbiased testing of some of these products that are marketed to you. There really isn't a lot of that third-party unbiased testing going on for things like biological products. So this can be a really good fit to test out those products that you might have heard of and might be curious about. So it's a good option for that, and we'll continue building our data set for biological trials. We're also going to carry forward with a staple trial type, our soybean inoculant, looking at both single versus double application, or single versus double inoculant and single versus no inoculant. And something that's new for 2021 is we'll look at expanding our single inoculant trials westward. So typically they've been in eastern Manitoba, where we have a little bit more soybean history. But I think that history is starting to build up in western Manitoba, certainly, and we can look at moving those trials to the west. And we're interested to see if they perform, similarly to what we've seen so far, which is that when you have soybean history, that single inoculant isn't making a big difference in terms of yield or nodulation even. So interested to see how that plays out as we move westward in different, soils and different growing season conditions and all those sorts of things. And then here's my comment on row spacing trials. So what we've done in the past with row spacing trials is we've kept seeding rate consistent across the different row spacings within the trial. And this year, we're just going to look at opening that up. So we can still run the trial that way if that's what the farmer would like to do, and look at, a change in row spacing, keeping seeding rate the same. But I think it's a little bit more in line with common farm practice to look at reducing seeding rate as we're widening the row. So just wanted to note that we're kind of opening that up this year, if that's something that's better suited to the decisions that you would make on your farm. And then, like I mentioned, we'll continue building out our seeding rate data as well, and starting to kind of fill in the gaps in those lower seeding rates to try and determine where that lower threshold is. In peas, like I mentioned, we'll continue building our pea fungicide data set. So we're interested to see how our proportion of responsive sites and economic response plays out as we continue to build that out. But we're also excited to launch into pea inoculant trials and pea seeding rate trials. So these are two new trial types for 2021. I'm particularly interested in our pea seeding rate trials, looking at the effect on standability and disease pressure, and then of course yield as well. And then just a couple of things to highlight for dry beans in 2021, like I mentioned, continuing with fungicide as well. But I'm particularly interested in finding growers who want to investigate their nitrogen fertility practices for dry beans. So we've looked at this on farm for 2 years now, and we only have about 4 trials worth of data. But when we take a look at what we're finding and what Kristen McMillan is finding in her small plot work, it seems like you can go in with much lower nitrogen rates than you might think for dry bean production in Manitoba. So we're interested in continuing to look at that and expanding on the sites that we already have. And we're also open to inoculant trials in dry beans as well. So kind of looking at that whole package of managing nitrogen nutrition for dry beans. And then again, this year we have a couple of tillage trials. So we just started that with one in 2020, and we have 2 more this year looking at strip till versus some form of conventional tillage. We're excited to carry forward with those as well. And then we'll also look at expanding our Faba bean fungicide data set. And like I talked about, we're interested to see how disease pressure plays out in different years, but also different regions in Manitoba, and then looking at a double versus single application where that disease pressure is there and seeing how that performs in our Faba beans. So just before we get to questions here, I just wanted to draw your attention to 2 things that you can find on our On-Farm Network portion of our website. The first being the 2020 On-Farm Network Results Series. So if you haven't seen this yet, it's a series of very short digestible videos that will go through all of the 2020 specific results for you. So that boils that down and packages that nicely. There should be in the next month or 2 some more combined results, like things that we talked about today, but I'll be able to go in a little bit more detail in kind of trial specific videos. Those will start appearing in the results series as well in the next couple of months, and we'll obviously communicate to you when that's available. And then also just our database online, which can be accessed if you go to the On-Farm Research Reports tab on the On-Farm Network. And you can filter it out however you would like to look at the different trial types or crop types you might be interested in. And it'll pull up all the relevant information in the table here. You can click on the trial ID and it'll take you right to the single page report for the individual trial that you might be interested in. And with that, I think I'll wrap up there, and we'll open it up to any questions, comments, ideas, anything you want to discuss for myself right now, or Jordan will be available to answer questions as well.
Great, thanks, Megan. We have quite a few questions here for you because you're so lucky. They're still coming in here, so I'm going to try to do these in order a little bit. Fungicide trials on soybeans. Did anyone try using Heads Up in place of fungicide?
No, I believe the only Heads Up products that we've tested in the On-Farm Network so far was a seed treatment. And we just have one of those trials. Other than that, in the fungicide trials, it's been more traditional fungicides, and there hasn't been a Heads Up mid-season spray that I can recall in the biological trials that we've done yet. So no, not yet.
Okay.
First scary.
Wondering if you noticed any increase on the disease incidence, disease severity under the narrow row spacing for soybean row spacing trials?
Good question. We haven't formally measured disease pressure in our soybean row spacing trials. I would say mainly because, you know, like we're seeing, like we talked about, foliar disease in soybeans generally isn't a big concern for yield considerations. I think that if it's definitely on my radar, and I think that if we had a growing season where we would expect white mold pressure to be high, that is something that I would consider going out and collecting data on in our soybean row spacing trials, particularly the ones that are using a like 7.5-inch row. For sure, that's something that I would consider doing, but we haven't done it yet, and there just hasn't really been the growing season to warrant that data collection yet. But it is on our radar, and it's something we will do if the conditions call for it.
Okay. 2 questions here on the fungicide trials. First, what weather patterns, what have the weather patterns been in the years the data was collected, and also any comparisons between products?
Sure. So on the weather pattern side, I think the largest range in growing season conditions that we've captured is with our soybean fungicide trials, because they've been conducted over the most years so far. I mean, I think we can all agree that the last few years have been pretty dry, so not the best conditions when you're looking for disease development, certainly. Good for your crop, not good for the disease. So I don't know, like this is why we do this research year over year and continue to build this data set so that we can see how these things are performing in the different growing season conditions. I think what we really need to kind of round out our data. Certainly on the soybean fungicide, I think we can start setting that trial type aside once I get a really wet year or 2 really wet years, where we can look at, you know, there's the conditions are there for white mold development, what's that pressure like, and how are our fungicides performing. So yeah, I guess that's exactly why we conduct this year over year, like I said, is to capture those different responses. On the product side of things, looking at product to product comparisons, we actually intentionally kind of shy away from doing product to product comparisons because the point of the on-farm network isn't to necessarily come out saying one product performs better than another. We can certainly offer farmer obviously tips and tricks and a suggested trial layout and things like that to conduct that on their farm, and I'm happy to do statistics for you on that data, etc. So we can definitely help out with that, but it's not something that we look to do in the on-farm network.
Great. Now a bunch of questions on the soybean seeding rate trials.
Sure.
Many people are asking whether these were all solid seeded or if you did solid seeded versus planters.
Yeah, so this is something that I'm hoping to include more details on in the kind of results series video that I mentioned will be going up in the next couple of months, is to kind of look at these different aspects as well. So we do have a range in seeding equipment and also row spacings in these trials. So we're looking at, you know, whatever makes sense for each individual farm and each individual farmer who's hosting a seeding rate trial. So I don't have an answer on what that looks like in terms of how the data plays out differently when we break it down by these, you know, different kind of compounding management decisions, but that information is coming.
Okay, so similarly to what you're talking about now, just one person is interested in knowing if you'll reveal the difference in seeding and planter types.
Yes,
so
I can do all that. I will summarize that. I've had a lot of questions on that, so I think that's something that would be really valuable to look at. And I do have, I should have specifics on what piece of equipment, seeding equipment, was used for each seeding rate trial. So I should be able to look at that and break it down in detail and get those results out.
Okay. A few more questions here. Are there big differences between seeding with a drill versus planter and also row spacing?
So looking at a drill versus a planter, I was actually quite disappointed in my data, if I do say so myself, when I looked at seed survivability, like when we look at comparing our seeding rates that we're using and the plant stands that we actually establish when we take our plant count early in the season. I was expecting there to be a much bigger difference when we grouped it by just generally planters and seeders, and there wasn't. So average survivability across, like when we broke down our 86 seeding rate trials and categorized them based on if it was a planter that was used or a seeder, average survivability for planters was 83% and average survivability for seeders was 80%. Now that groups together, all, like I said, it's just two categories. It's not broken down any further than that, which is kind of the next step that I'll take with the data. So we aren't seeing overall a big shocking difference in survivability. But this comes back to what I talked about, that it's very farm specific. So I think that's something that you really need to evaluate. If you do any form of data collection on your farm on a regular basis, I would highly recommend that it's assessing your plant stand, because I think that's a really valuable piece of information for you to have.
Okay, and so for each of these, sorry?
Was there a second part to that question?
No, I think you're pretty clear.
It goes on row spacing, Megan.
Oh, thank you, Jordan. I just deleted it, so I'm glad you said that.
Oh, looking at, I'm assuming survivability and row spacing, I assume is what the question's about. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so this is interesting. This is also something that will be included in the kind of results video targeted at the row spacing trials. And this is also a reason why I want to open up the treatment options to include a reduced seeding rate at a wider row spacing. So I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, but what we observe in our row spacing trials where we keep seeding rate consistent, as we widen the row, we obviously have more plants within the row, right? And we can see evidence of like plant to plant competition within the row, and some of those plants get really scrawny and are certainly not making it to the end of the season. I haven't seen anything too shocking off the top of my head in terms of, you know, we're not losing a ton of plants by the end of the season, but those effects are there, and I think that effect would be greatly reduced, obviously, if you're kind of reducing your seeding rate as you widen that row, and just giving each plant more room within the row. So something we're going to continue to evaluate going forward, and like I said, I'll include that in the soybean row spacing results video as well.
In your data collection, do you have a breakdown of emergence rates versus seeding rates on the same plots and plant stand data?
On the same plots?
Yeah.
I'm not sure I understand the question, but I can tell you what we do. So we assess plant stand early in the season. I think we target V2 or V3 is a early season plant stand assessment timing that we target. So I have the ability to calculate survivability for every trial that we run, regardless if it's a seeding rate trial or otherwise. So I do have that information, yes.
Thank you. In the soybean row closing trials, what plant types are you using, bush type or single stalk, and is there a difference?
So we haven't broken it down yet by variety type. So again, it's very farm specific, right? This is one of the things that happens with an on-farm program where you're looking at these things for each individual farmer's circumstances and decisions that they're making. So the varieties will vary from trial to trial, and that is also something that I'll include in those results videos. Matt, I'm really pumping up these results series videos. I better make sure they're good.
For soybean inoculant trials, do you or can you include whether using liquid, peat, or granular inoculant in the trials? There's a large difference in costs.
Great question. Yes, we should be able to break all of that down because we should have that information as well, which type of product was used in the trial. So I can include that in the economic analysis going forward.
Okay. Jordan, there's one question for you here. Was there any wheat on wheat rotations in your fungicide study?
I don't think there was wheat on wheat. I believe there might have been a wheat on barley or oat. But I'm quite certain there wasn't wheat on wheat, but I can definitely look into that. I believe, I'm just off the top of my head, most of it was on canola or soybeans.
Okay. New question here for Megan. Saw a fair amount of Stemphylium blight in Faba beans this year in southwest Manitoba. Would be interested in seeing some fungicide data on this in the future. More of a comment.
Yeah, that's actually a very good comment because right now, so it was our first year doing the Faba bean fungicide trials. So our protocol always takes a couple years to kind of iron out the kinks and determine what data collection we need. And Stemphylium is actually something I definitely need to put on that list because I think we had a fair bit of that in the Swan River trial. So yeah, if you're an agronomist who has farmers, or if you're a farmer who wants to do that, please get in touch with me because I'm interested in that as well.
Perfect. So I don't have any other questions coming in, but I do just want to note that if anybody thinks of anything, that Megan and Jordan are, I think, almost always available for questions if you have any about the trial specifically, or Daryl Rex from MCA. If you're interested in doing any of these trials in the future or just looking into them further, feel free to contact anybody on the screen right now. And stay tuned for more data to come in the future. Also visit our websites for some of the final data that you can sort of sift through on your own. But I think, oh, I have one more question. Jordan, have you done any studies on ESN in corn?
I don't think we had any producers in that split nitrogen trial using ESN. We did have quite a few use Agritane. We didn't have any Super U either. And again, Agritane was used either in the spring or a few times during the side dress application. So I don't have anything, at least on-farm setting, that worked with ESN. I believe John Hurd would be the one to talk to about that. I know he's done quite a bit of small plot research and maybe even some field scale stuff with ESN, and even Don Flayton has worked with some master students on trials like that address quite a bit more types of fertilizer used for corn.
Yeah, agreed. And if you were interested in doing one of those trials eventually, maybe you could speak with Jordan about squeaking that in on the nitrogen trial, if that's potential for the future, if there's room.
Also,
okay, so I don't, sorry.
Also, if there's rain.
Jordan's open to it. Okay, so no more questions. I'll have this wrapped up then now. Thank you everybody for attending. And again, if you want the recording, visit one of our websites in the next few days. I'll be plugged up there shortly, hopefully. So thank you everybody again, and have a great rest of your Friday, and enjoy your weekend. Thank you.
Thanks, Morgan.